Now, let me introduce our speaker. Damon Linker is senior correspondent at theweek.com and a consulting editor at the University of Pennsylvania Press. He was formerly a contributing editor at The New Republic and is the author of 2 books, The Theocons and The Religious Test. As I refer to him as Dr. Linker. He is, in fact, does in fact have a PhD from my alma mater, Michigan State University, although he does not share my rather fruitless love right now of MSU basketball. He has a master's degree from NYU and a bachelor's degree from Ithaca College. He's a native New Yorker, right?
Yep.
So do you remember when? Do you remember New York when the tallest building was the Empire State Building?
No, the World Trade Center was built right around the time I came to conscious awareness as a child, so they were always there.
I actually lived in New York from 1962 to 1965. So for me, New York is always the Empire State Building.
Right.
But he writes a column 3 times a week for The Week. He also writes for such venues as the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. I try to make a point of reading all of his columns because I find him one of the most thoughtful, provocative, and interesting voices writing on the center-left today. I think he always has something interesting to say. It's always something that makes me think about what my own opinions are. And I do recommend his body of work to you. If you're looking for a political commentator who isn't entirely predictable and will always provoke thought, then I need look no further than Damon Linker. Without further ado, I give you Damon.
Thank you, Professor Kneppenberg, for that very flattering introduction. I hope I can live up to the billing. I thank you also for everyone involved in funding and organizing this event and helping to get me here in one piece when weather threatened to scuttle the whole thing. I'm happy to have made it. My title for my remarks are a little bit of variation on the title of the conference as a whole: The Necessity and Impossibility of Restoring Community in a Polarized Age. As with a lot of my columns, you will recognize if you read me regularly, I like being a provocateur, which means that I offer you that title as a provocation to thought, about 70% sincerely and 30% kind of winking at you. Is it possible for us to overcome our polarization? Maybe, but I think that it's worth taking seriously the obstacles to that happening and to think through why it might be unlikely. And also just how difficult it would be to recapture something like national cohesion or community at this point in our history. As almost any historian of the United States will tell you, there's nothing more distinctively American than believing that America is on the verge of losing a sense of community it once enjoyed. This is certainly the case. It was certainly the case in the run-up to the Civil War. It was absolutely the case during the bloodletting of the Civil War itself. It was definitely so during the tense aftermath of that conflict, which coincided with the rise of industrialization, which drove many Americans from rural life to urban life and sparked a reaction that coalesced in the Populist Party and then the Progressive Movement as a response that sought to achieve reunification at the national level with the help of a newly empowered federal government. It was certainly the case in the years leading up to the First World War and then the Second World War, and it was once again felt profoundly during the sharp cultural upheaval of the 1960s. And we feel it again today, when the cultural polarization of the 60s and its aftermath which never really healed, has now widened into a degree of political polarization unseen perhaps since the 1850s. The Pew Center, which does some of the best polling in the country, had a poll a few months ago in the fall. It's an ongoing poll where they ask people questions about their political views, Republicans, Democrats, and they have, like 20, 30 years ago, it looked sort of like a bell curve. So you had Democrats and Republicans overlapping, mostly about 70% overlap, with, of course, small tails on the far right and the far left, with the vast majority falling somewhere in the center, again, with a lot of overlap. You can actually click on this map with a graphic online, and you can see a time lapse of the findings that lead to this graph from polling over the years since the 90s. And you see the two halves pulling apart, pulling apart, pulling apart, so that this past fall, I don't have the exact number before me, but basically the median Republican is to the right of something like 93% of Democrats, and the median Democrat is to the left of something like 90% of Republicans, which means that the two parties have almost no overlap at all anymore. That's a very vivid public opinion basis for this observation about the polarization today. So, can the feeling that we've often sensed in this country at various moments in our history be easily dismissed? Is it an enduring aspect of the American experience that so often seems to afflict us in the present, only to be surpassed by a new experience of it in the future, this sense of losing community we once enjoyed? I'd like to suggest that cultural and political polarization and an attendant loss of national community is getting worse in our time, and that there's reason to suspect we may lack the resources to stop or reverse it. I sort of joke online sometimes that my nickname should be Damon Downer, and I guess that comes from the fact that I would always prefer bracing truths to consoling lies. So, my analysis will combine observations drawn from the history of political philosophy with reflection on the unpredictable ways in which these aspects of our common life are interacting with technological developments that these philosophers could hardly have imagined. So, my first observation is simple and even obvious. We simply may be too big. Like all the ancient philosophers, and some modern political philosophers as well, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, believed that a democratic republic, always fragile, could only have a chance of thriving if it was small, allowing for the reinforcement of cohesion and active participation in public decisions on the part of all adult citizens, who should ideally be capable of joining together in a common physical space to deliberate and vote on matters of public import. That's obviously not possible in a country of 320 million people spanning a 3,000-mile wide continent. Now, I'll return to this first observation about size in a moment in light of modern technology, which complicates it. As I'll be talking about shortly, there's a way in which social media especially does facilitate the formation of community, political community, across these vast spaces in a way that, say, the American founders could not have anticipated, but it happens in a way that actually cuts against what those founders would have liked to see. My second observation is equally simple and obvious. We may well be too diverse, religiously, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, to enjoy the kind of fellow feeling and social trust that healthy politics requires. At this point, I'd like to recommend, take a look, if it interests you at all, the journalist Megan McArdle wrote a really interesting long essay for Bloomberg View on Denmark a month or so ago. She has just left Bloomberg and is now writing for the Washington Post, but She also wrote a piece about 6 months or a year ago on Utah on the same theme. This was about the fact that for a lot of people on the left in this country, Denmark is a kind of ideal. Bernie Sanders talked a lot about how his vision of what our politics should do would make us more like Denmark. And I admire the Scandinavian countries a lot. I admire Europe. I've lived in Germany for a year. I like European society in many ways, among them because of the fact that they have universal health care. Healthcare, even though it's universal, is far cheaper than ours. They spend much less per capita on healthcare than we do, despite the fact that many fewer are covered here. They have a generous welfare state, relatively high taxes, and yet a freer regulatory environment in a lot of ways for business. So there's a lot to admire in those countries. But McCardle's essay talks a lot about this and discusses it in terms of social trust and cohesion. Denmark is able to achieve this incredible social welfare system in part because it's small, it only has about 8 million people, and it's incredibly homogeneous. There's an amazing amount of social trust and efficiency in public institutions that this country has never enjoyed. And I think it's getting worse in this country as the years go on, which makes it much more complicated for us to achieve anything like what you see in the Scandinavian countries, which again are incredibly homogeneous by American standards. And again, she wrote a piece about Utah that reflected on the same theme from a different angle, that Utah, by all kinds of measures, actually is doing very well economically and in terms of poverty and addressing social welfare problems in a way. And one reason why they're able to do that is because the Mormon Church is so prominent and there is relative homogeneity in the state compared to a lot of other areas of the country. So I don't want to make it seem as if you have to have kind of racial purity in order to have decent politics. That's not my point. My point is that the more diverse you get along any axis, the more complicated it's going to be to develop the kind of consensus as a society that's required to do big things, including social welfare programs, high tax rates, and those social welfare programs actually working. Now, at the time of the nation's founding, the country was overwhelmingly populated by settlers from the British Isles, with some Germans thrown in the mix. That meant that they were mostly white and Protestant and English-speaking, with, of course, the black population, slaves with no political rights or capacity to engage in politics at all. And of course, for political purposes, the citizens were also all male. Women were counted as, in the census, but they couldn't vote, so they had no direct say in politics either. The country's roughly 4 million citizens also lived on the eastern edge of a continent in just 13 states. Today, 320 million Americans live in 50 states spread across a 3,000-mile wide continent. Waves of immigrants have added their distinctiveness to the culture, first Catholics from Ireland, then Catholics from Southern Europe, and various Christians and Jews from Eastern Europe, then numerous groups from Asia and Latin America. African slaves were also freed and made citizens, and women were given the right to vote. That makes our country inconceivably more diverse and complex than we were at the time of the founding. And within the past generation, we've also seen the rise of an ideology of identity politics, which has convinced members of each of these groups, and others, like homosexuals and most recently transgender people, to insist that their participation in public life must be conducted on the terms of those groups, or the members of those groups. The whole of the country must recognize and affirm the worth of each part before anyone is willing to recognize and affirm the worth of the whole. Champions of identity politics tell Latinos, for example, that they participate in politics first and foremost as, not as Americans, but first and foremost as Latinos. The same holds for women and African Americans and gays and so on through each conceivable identity group. including the mixtures of identities emphasized by the even more recent ideology of intersectionality. Now, for instance, a disabled transgendered black woman can make distinctive claims on the public, demanding recognition for and affirmation of her distinctive difference as the focal point for her political participation. And this gets replicated not quite at the level of each individual being their own group, but the groups get smaller and smaller and more granular and more complex, with each of them sort of battling each other as we try to figure out who we are, this amalgam of all of these parts. The consequence of all of these trends tends to be a form of politics marked by zero-sum contests. I assume you all know what that means from game theory, the notion that not that you and a competing partner can reach a kind of compromise or conciliation in which you both benefit, but it's an either-or contest. So either I win or you win. We can't both win or get something to benefit from the competition. It tends to be a zero-sum contest among competing factions, and I'll be talking a lot about this term over the next few minutes, rather than a search for consensus, conciliation, and compromise. Pushed to an extreme, this form of politics can culminate in a denial that anyone ever can speak for the whole of the nation, or even in the assertion that the whole is an illusion or a source of oppression that must be resisted. At its most furthest extreme, it can become the claim that the whole is just the sum of its aggregate parts, with no independent meaning or worth as a whole, which has the effect of making our public life a form of civil war conducted by barely other means. Now, America's constitutional framers were very well aware of the problem of faction in politics. Indeed, according to James Madison's famous discussion in Federalist 10, the intricate constitutional mechanism of American government is a complex apparatus designed in part to mitigate the effects of faction. So why does it seem to have stopped working in our time? Now, there are undoubtedly many causes, including the size and diversity that I've already mentioned, but I'd like to spend the remainder of my remarks focusing on one additional factor: technology, and especially the technology of social media. National cohesion and community probably reached a high watermark in the 1940s and 50s, in part because the country at the time had an intact public culture dominated by a small number of media companies that functioned as civic authorities to which most people deferred. A handful of TV channels, weekly news magazines, and newspapers set the tone and agenda for the country as a whole. And they each reinforced a Whiggish, progressive vision of American history and civil religion. I don't know if you know the term Whiggish. It just means a kind of notion that history unfolds in a sense of progress, that at any given moment things are going to be better, and they are better than they used to be. So we're kind of going ever onward and upward as history unfolds. And this has always been a temptation in American public life, and the kind of combined institutions that I mentioned of media, the TV stations, news magazines, and newspapers of the mid-century before the middle of, say, the 1960s, very much reinforced this message. The presidency reinforced it as well. The popular culture, all of it reinforced this general vision and message without a lot of challenge. However, the proliferation of alternative sources of information over the past 50 years has changed all of this, and none of them more than the rise of social media. Social media allows for the building of fellow feeling and the formation of groups in virtual space. That's novel in human history. If you were a passionately committed racist in the 1920s in, say, Indiana, you might seek out and join with other racists into a white supremacist faction. You'd maybe join a local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. You could do a lot to terrorize blacks, Catholics, and Jews in your corner of the country. But your ability to affect change and influence the country as a whole was very limited to the physical space in which you lived and where you were bound to be confined for most of your life. Some people would travel, there was immigration within the country, but pretty much, if you were committed to a factional cause, you were limited to organizing with other members of that faction within the proximal physical space that you occupied, your neighborhood, your county, your area of wherever you lived in whichever state it was. But today, thanks to social media, things are radically different. Today, if you're a member of the alt-right, you can find thousands or more than thousands of like-minded individuals in chat rooms, on 4chan, on Reddit, on Twitter, on Facebook, maybe even in the White House. The same holds for those who are passionately anti-Trump, or strongly devoted to libertarian economics, or committed to transgender rights, or to the victory of the Democratic Party in its quest to win a congressional majority in the upcoming midterm elections, and on and on and on, through any and all political positions. Each of these groups of the like-minded is what the American founders would have called a faction. Their formation and mobilization is no longer limited by physical space. And in a diverse country of 320 million, the pool of potential recruits for each is, from the standpoint of James Madison, mind-bogglingly enormous. Many of these factions reinforce their own cohesion by defining themselves by opposition to others. Trump voters hate liberals. Liberals with a U, liberals. Transgender activists love to hate conservative evangelical Christians. Black Lives Matter activists love to hate police unions. Richard Spencer's neo-Nazi group loves to hate everyone except non-Jewish Caucasians. Bernie Sanders supporters love to hate centrist Democrats, and so forth. My favorite metaphor to describe this situation is centrifugal force. Social media has created conditions under which factions are proliferating, and many of them thrive in direct proportion to their ability to define themselves in opposition to other factions. As a result, the distance separating these factions from the others, each of these factions from the others, grows greater with each passing week, just as the contents of a spinning centrifuge move ever further away from the center. You can think of a spinning top-loading washing machine, although that doesn't quite even work for this because there's a limit to how far everything can spread because you have the outside walls of the tub of the washing machine. So think of, it's almost like if the universe is expanding, like the walls of the observable universe are actually getting further and further away as the whole grows. That's sort of what's happening. And as that happens, and as astrophysicists will tell you, cosmologists, somehow within the universe, each point in the universe is moving away from every other point. So if we look in any direction at the universe, every galaxy that we see is actually moving farther away from us as if we were at the center. But of course we're not. It's that the whole is expanding and all of the parts within it are expanding from each other. That's kind of the model of what seems to be happening in American culture and politics and our moment. Inside each of these factions, members enjoy very high levels of trust, community, and fellow feeling. That's what people who observe social media talk about as like bandwagoning or clustering, this tendency of on Facebook to tend to have friends who all sort of agree with you. And so you post things like the latest outrage, say you're a liberal, you post the latest outrage about Trump and all your friends go, oh my gosh, I can't believe how terrible that is. Yeah, I know, what a lunatic, we're all doomed, this is terrible, I hate him. And they all just reinforce that tendency. And the same thing happens on the right and in each of the factions. So not just left and right, but like sub-factions within sub-factions. And each of them reinforcing each other. And inside, again, each of these, you get to enjoy something analogous a little bit to what I described earlier as the vision of ancient politics, or that Rousseau talked about. A small community of like-minded individuals trying to decide what they think is good and how to kind of live and orient themselves in the world. But the problem is that we still have a whole outside of those parts. And who speaks for that? How do we all come together, all of those kind of micro communities, all of those factions, to talk to each other about what we share in common? That's the tricky part. The sensation of trust, community, and fellow feeling within these factions is made possible by that faction's distrust, lack of community, and absence of fellow feeling in relation to those outside the faction. The parts are thriving, but the whole seems to be dissolving or pulling apart. Now, I want to say parenthetically, I'm not up here saying that it's, the early months of 1861 and we're about to have the Civil War Part 2. And one reason why I don't think that's about to happen is precisely this weird characteristic of the factions of our time. I mean, if ever there was a civil war where physical space was extremely important, it was the Civil War in this country, where you had two very opposed factions who lined up precisely along a physical border in space, making a civil war extremely easy to enact. You had the South and the North and a line. And there were people on one side and the other, and they could each pick up weapons and then fight each other like a kind of old-fashioned war where you're actually fighting over where to draw the line between the two, and one side had to invade and conquer the other in order to bring it to an end. That's a classic war, all the way back to the ancient world. Like, that's what a war is. So it was in that way sort of predetermined that that could unfold in the way it did. Whereas in our time, we talk about red state and blue state. Of course, that's completely simplified. It's not that we have red states and blue states. We have red communities and blue communities, and they're often right next to each other or nested within each other. You often have city centers in many places that are very liberal, surrounded by more conservative suburbs or exurbs, and then you have rural areas that tend to be uniformly red, and then you have cities in other parts of the country like the South and the Southwest where you have actual city centers that are actually pretty conservative in at least some places. You have some states that are uniformly blue and others that are uniformly red. California is all the populated centers of California are as blue as could be, and then you have these areas in the more rural parts of the state that are as red could be. So like, where are the lines where such a war could take place? I don't even see how it's conceivable. You sometimes have, on my very street in the suburbs of Philadelphia before the last election, you had Trump signs next to Hillary Clinton signs. You had cars with Bernie Sanders stickers on them with Marco Rubio stickers from the primaries. You had all of it, all jostling together. So we're like all rubbing up against each other in real space, while inhabiting a kind of mental space that is no longer lining up with that physical space. We somehow are in the world, but ideologically not of the physical world, because as political actors, we often are living within a kind of virtual space made possible by technology. So what can be done about it? Hell if I know. I don't want to end on a completely bleak note, but I will actually try to avoid ending on a bleak note by being even bleaker. And I was inspired to add this little postscript to my remarks, in part because of the news that President Trump has apparently chosen a man named John Bolton to be his new national security advisor. John Bolton is, you know the terms hawk and dove, even though you never hear the term dove anymore because there seem to be so few of them in our public life. A dove is someone who is kind of reflexively anti-war, and then a hawk is someone who's reflexively anti or who's pro-war or anti-peace. And John Bolton is among the most hawkish people in American public life. He has supported every war this country has fought since Vietnam and advocated many, many more than that. He's in favor of preemptively bombing countries to get them to advance American interests in all kinds of ways. And President Trump, or whether or not you affirm him and his agenda, the truth is that he doesn't really know all that much and listens to advisors. I mean, he's not a politician, he's a businessman, and doesn't have a knowledge base to make a lot of independent decisions about things. And the idea that he's listening to John Bolton, or will be soon, about what to do in foreign policy is pretty terrifying, I think. So I want to leave you with one insight or a thought about how it's possible that we could try to generate this lost sense of national cohesion and community in a polarized age. And this is a suggestion that a writer named Hamid of the Brookings Institution recently proposed before Bolton was announced. The one thing that might affirm the reality and necessity of a national whole in which all these factions are a part is the rise of a threat from outside the whole, right? If each of these parts is thriving by defining itself opposed to the other parts, then our whole as a nation can define itself in opposition to other external wholes. In other words, think of our nation now as a part in the international whole of the whole globe, and if we are at war with another part or national whole, then our national whole can come together. I don't mean an ersatz threat by a petty tyrant on the other side of the planet. You know, one of the wars that we fought since the middle of the 20th century, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, these countries like 7,000 miles away, where troops who volunteer are sent to fight, and most Americans can kind of put it out of their mind and not even think about it. I mean a real war, the kind of war that this country has never seen in our living lifetimes, except maybe people who still remember World War II. Although note that other than Pearl Harbor, even World War II was not actually fought here. It was fought over there, as they used to say. I'm talking about, you want to see the rise of national cohesion. I mean a war here on our shores. An existential threat, a real physical threat that can threaten us, our nation, an old-fashioned war, an invasion by a foreign power. Yes, I consider that a cure far, far worse than the disease. But that brings me back to my title, The Necessity and Impossibility of Restoring Community in a Polarized Age. You're welcome. Thanks. Do you want me to just stay up here for questions?
Yeah. Any questions? Well, I'll start.
Okay.
A lot of the audience, students in my class, one of the books that I've offered them the opportunity to read as an option is Once the Future Liberal. And it seems to me that you're disagreeing in some measure with Mark Lilla's at least aspiration, that there can be a kind of non-intersectional, non-identity politics vision articulated on behalf of the Democratic Party. Can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, sure. Mark Lilla is my friend and teacher, and I read that book as he was writing it and gave him feedback on it. So I'm, hesitant to be too critical of it. I'm sympathetic to a lot of his analysis and what he's trying to achieve. But yes, the truth is that I think he's thinking about a lost moment. I mean, the whole book is written kind of as an attempt to sort of recapture the moment from 1933 to say 1968, or maybe, I don't know, 76, something like that. And that would be great, but I just don't see it happening. I think that the country has evolved, the Democratic Party has evolved in a different direction, and I frankly think, much as I'm sympathetic to a lot of his critique of identity politics, I don't think that it's something that can just be wished away. The Democratic Party is a coalition of groups. It sort of always has been. It's just that the number of those groups has proliferated as American society has become more complex, as I sort of narrated in my remarks. So the idea that we can kind of put that genie back in the bottle and just sort of be Americans again in some extra, the interesting thing about that book is he's not really against identity. He's against identity at the sub-political level. He wants identity actually at the national level, so something like what I'm talking about as a lost vision. And he sees sub-political assertions of identity on the part of groups as inimical to that. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that, but I don't see any solution to it. And in fact, the vociferous reaction to that book, very hostile response from a lot of prominent liberals, Democrats, progressives, is a sign of that very thing. That the very attempt to hold up an ideal of unity actually divides us further and makes us angrier at each other.
As you were speaking, I recall this title, which a book that probably could not be written or published now, by Alan Wolfe in 1998, One Nation After All. And his suggestion was that the divisions were exaggerated. Now you would say they may have been exaggerated in 1998, but they're certainly not exaggerated now.
Well, I did one caveat to that that's interesting. There is some dispute among people who do polling about how to put this. People who follow politics tend to have well-formed views about politics. Because we live in a polarized time, people who have well-formed views about politics tend to be sort of on one pole or the other. Another additional complication. A lot of people don't agree to answer the questions when pollsters call. They hang up on them. Who does answer the questions? Those who are informed and interested about politics. So there is a possibility that maybe we aren't really as polarized as we seem, but rather we have like 10% on one side and 10% on the other. And again, a country of 320 million people, that's a lot of people. That's tens of millions of people who are on Twitter and Facebook talking about politics and organizing and joining groups and marching and protesting and answering the questions of pollsters and watching Fox News or listening to a left-wing podcast, And that is the people who keep getting reflected in our attempts to gauge public opinion. And that actually the vast majority of Americans don't really follow politics much, just as they never really have. And they're sort of apathetic. Their attitude, they're captured maybe in the polls that show that like 90% of Americans disapprove of Congress. So that actually, so that, I just wanted to add that as like a skeptical, that you should always carry around in the back of your head. Like, what do we really know about American public opinion? If you refuse to talk to a pollster, then your outlook hasn't been registered. And if you refuse to talk to a pollster because you really don't have strong political opinions, then your sort of indifference and, I guess, kind of flabby, ill-informed, centrist, non-engaged position hasn't been reflected, and we don't even know you exist. And so it looks like we're on the verge of this kind of virtual civil war, but it's really only these kind of hyper-political extremes that are. I just wonder about that. Yeah?
So you talked a lot about how social media kind of expedites polarization, current polarization. Social media is fairly new, and one of the other speakers talked about how we still haven't developed social norms for social media.
Yeah.
Do you think maybe there's any way that we could not regulate, censor, or just even speak to these companies that at the end of the day, their companies are not part of government? But do you think there's any way that we can kind of change the way we interact with social media to aid against polarization, to contain polarization, or do you think it's gone far past that and we just have to deal with the problem now?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think on the margins, like a little bit, we can do some things. Like, for instance, Twitter would be a somewhat less toxic place if you couldn't have anonymous accounts. Because allowing anonymous accounts allows people to act like total thugs to each other without any social repercussions. Plus, it also creates a veil to cover over for bots, Russian operatives or whoever they are, who just kind of go online to stir up trouble. And you see this happening more and more, like a big story breaks and immediately, like say after the big shooting in Parkland, Florida, like someone actually wrote a story a week or so after that to show that within the first half hour after that story broke, the most polarizing statements about guns on either side were posted by anonymous accounts, who very well could have been Russian operatives. I mean, I'm not someone who really pushes the kind of Russian conspiracy theory, Russia gave us Trump. I don't think there's much to that, although Trump really does love Putin. But it is true that one of Putin's strategies is actually less than putting a puppet in the White House. Putin just wants to stir up anarchy in liberal democracies so that we're fighting each other rather than creating trouble for him. So it could be that a few hundred Russian bots sitting in a room outside of St. Petersburg posted those very polarizing statements like, yeah, about time to take all those guns and melt them down. Like, oh yeah, we better arm everyone in America with machine guns to protect ourselves. The most extreme statement of either side's view. And you put them out and retweet them enough, and suddenly, liberals are hitting and the conservatives are hitting each other over it, and then you have a food fight in the room, and the bots are like,
no one knows who threw the first out.
Exactly, because it doesn't matter. So you could sort of help with that if you didn't allow anonymous accounts. But there's a more difficult problem that I don't think can be addressed, and it's not simply a kind of temporal issue that like the horse has left the barn. It has to do structurally with the way social media works, in that what we're living through is that nobody has the authority to speak for the whole. That's the problem. And so when Twitter or Facebook tries to create rules, like you can't say this, or they ban a certain account by a prominent, say, far-right person like Richard Spencer or a far left agitator, as soon as they make that move, you have lots of people who respond and see that very move as a provocation. Like, look, you show that you're biased on the other side. You're actually like, look, Twitter is actually like pro-Hillary Clinton because they just banned a super, toxic right-wing anti-Hillary account. And so that very move to impose universal rules becomes in the eyes of many, actually a factional move. So it isn't the whole speaking, it's actually just another part, which then you get accusations of like bad faith and dishonesty and all of these claims like you're pretending to speak for the whole, but you're actually just trying to elect a Democrat next time. And so it sort of reproduces the very problem that there is no one who can stand up and say, I speak for the common good, because it's as if we don't believe there is a common good anymore, or we don't even know how to formulate it. So, yeah.
Do you think that the plethora of subgroups and intersectionality weakens the Democratic Party?
I think that's also a complicated question. I mean, the Democratic Party has, a very mixed, and I don't mean negative mixed, I mean like sometimes it wins, sometimes it loses. Obama won 53% of the vote with a coalition that was filled with intersectional groups. And so, that's much better than Donald Trump's 46% of the vote, and it's a lot better than it's better than George W. Bush's re-election of 50.7% of the vote. It's better than lots of people. So how can you say that intersectionality has weakened the Democratic Party? I think that where someone like Mark Lilla, I think, is onto something in pushing that kind of an argument is actually more at the local level, because what you get these days is a kind of nationalization of politics. So you have outlets like on the right, especially like Fox News, who have a kind of industry in finding a kind of extreme left-wing statement by some intersectional group and putting it on live TV and saying, that's the Democratic Party. In other words, you're not part of that party. That's this party of all these kind of scary groups who you don't live in your little town that's homogeneously white or something like this. And then what you get then is that at a local level, a Democrat who's trying to run a kind of more moderate or like less intersectional kind of agenda for his local community gets tarred with that, and then has a harder time and will sometimes lose out to the Republican. And this is, I do think, has contributed to the fact that in 2016, perhaps as shocking as Trump winning was that, the Republicans won everything. They won well over a majority of state houses, well over a majority of governors' mansions, well over a majority of the House seats and the Senate seats. Like they kind of ran the tables at every level of government. And so at the local level, I think in Western Pennsylvania, Connor Lamb just won barely in a race there. And there have been a lot of special elections in around the country since Trump won, in which Democrats have done very well. And they've done well partly because Democrats hate Trump. So as long as he's there, he's kind of mobilizing Democrats to show up and vote, which is also very important. But you also, you have someone like Connor Lamb, who runs as kind of a more, at least culturally more moderate guy, and therefore does pretty well when he does that. So that's my kind of muddled, complex answer. I mean, I think, I do think the thing about Lilla's book that I do agree with is that the Democratic Party should strive as much as possible to speak for as many people as possible. So I guess that's what I'll leave it at. Yeah.
As an editor, are there any guidelines you set to not fuel polarization, or do you sort of feel like it's okay to appeal to factions with certain subjects?
Well, I mean, as an editor right now in my life, I'm a book editor, and there it doesn't really come in because I'm mostly publishing like academic scholarship, which is usually sort of extra political. It's just, it operates on its own. I know the right likes to say like, academics are like very left-wing, uniformly left-wing. But the reality is that most scholarship operates according to the logic of the scholarly community and an advancing a research agenda. And at a deep level, there might be a kind of progressive skew to that. But when it comes to evaluating any given manuscript, it's evaluated in terms of how strong it is as scholarship. But I have been a magazine editor and a website editor, and I deal with people who edit my stuff all the time at the Week. And yeah, I mean, there is a certain extent to which you get clicks by appealing to sub-factions. One reason why I actually have less of a following than I might, I mean, I do fine, but like, there are people even at the Week who get, on average, a lot more traffic than I do. And that's because they are speaking consistently and to a faction and cultivating their like of their position. So, well, you know, for instance, a guy named Ryan Cooper is a very smart guy on the left. I recommend reading him at the Week. But he is on the left consistently all the time, pushing an agenda, hitting the right hard, and doing very thoughtful, extended think pieces about what the Democratic Party should do. And for him, it's always move further left. It's be Bernie Sanders-like. It's pushing a very ambitious social welfare agenda, raising taxes on the wealthy, all kinds of things like this. And because of that, his traffic dwarfs mine, or mine is dwarfed by his traffic, because he has, over the months and years, cultivated an audience of fervent leftists who love his stuff, and they read every column, and they retweet it, and they post it on Facebook, and they love it. My stuff tends to be sort of like, it's funny, on the back end of editing online, there are certain tags you can attach, like kind of meaning like internet search tags. And at the Week, everyone probably does this, they do like feature, politics, and then liberal or conservative are tags. And I swear, like I'm like half liberal, half conservative. Like, and that means that I don't cultivate any consistent attitude. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm always a kind of bland centrist, kind of at the empty set, sort of negating each side. What it means is that on a particular issue, I think the left has the better of the argument, and on another issue, I think the right has it better of it, and so I hit the left, then I hit the right, and the cumulative effect, if you read my stuff over a long period of time, is you do get a linker sensibility that is a kind of muscular centrism, but it's inconsistent and kind of quirky to me. And that means that the number of fans that I have is sort of limited, because I'm not cultivating the factions. I take a little from different factions. So there you go, a little confessional about my traffic woes at the Week. Thankfully, I have an editor who values what I bring to the site beyond simple, huge traffic numbers. Every now and then, like, I was a big critic of Hillary Clinton before the election, though. I supported her and thought that she was clearly better than Trump, and was shocked when she lost and all of this, but I wrote a lot of critical Hillary Clinton pieces. Every now and then, the Drudge Report, you know, the right-wing clearinghouse website, would link to one of my Hillary bashing columns, and then that would be like the biggest traffic hit of the month for me. I would get like 1.5 million unique views, where normally I would get like 30,000. So that shows, like, at that moment I spoke to a faction, a big faction, and they rewarded me with clicks. Yeah.
You're right now in Pennsylvania living through one of the potential, or about to live through the potential antidotes to the kind of polarization, which is a weakening of the capacity of either party to gerrymander districts. Do you have any hope that a weakening of the capacity to draw district boundaries to favor the electoral fortunes of either party, make districts more competitive, will pull politicians back toward a kind of centrist?
Not exactly, although why is an interesting issue, so I'm glad you brought this up. For those of you who aren't aware, there's been a big battle in Pennsylvania over the last couple of months. Republicans have been in charge of the state house and legislature in Pennsylvania for a long time, and they have managed to draw districts. There are 18 districts for the House in Pennsylvania. And they've drawn the districts to absolutely maximize Republican advantage. So in the last 2 elections, if you take statewide vote, Democrats have won slightly over half of the votes, about 52% over Republicans. The current delegation to the House from Pennsylvania is 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats. Think about how skewed that is. That's 72% of the congressional delegation is Republican, when Republicans won 48% of the vote. That's about as radical of a gerrymander as you can get. And you do it by clumping Democrats together into single districts and then spreading out the Republican districts. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court a couple of months ago ruled that this violated the Pennsylvania state constitution. Republicans have been furious. They've threatened to they threatened to impeach the Democratic justices who voted this way. They've appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and just this last week the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the appeal, which means that the ruling stands, and they have redrawn the districts in such a way that most people think will yield either a 9-9 breakdown or maybe 10-8 Republicans. So still a slight Republican advantage, but much more even. So again, so back to Professor Knippenberg's question, will that help to restore centrism? And my answer is I don't think so, because, and in some ways it could even exacerbate it, because if you watch and listen to, say, the Trumpist populist faction of the Republicans and how they talk, and you hear it on Fox all the time, there really is a genuine sense in which those people think that they are the true America, and they are the people. And it makes no sense to me, and I've argued this online and in columns for months, this notion that Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by almost 3 million votes, and yet, because Trump won the Electoral College, somehow that's an expression of the American people saying no to progressives and to the left, and somehow the American people are back in charge. Well, the only way the Republicans have achieved this is through things like the Electoral College, which is a counter-majoritarian institution and allows people sometimes, and unfortunately twice within the last couple of decades, allows the person who gets fewer votes to win. And this discrepancy of 3 million votes is the biggest ever, and it's alarming. And yet, you must have seen this, that the Claremont crowd does this a lot, talking about how like Trump is the voice of the people, even though, yeah, okay, but fewer people than the Hillary Clinton voters. Like, what are you talking about? So if we adjust these structural things so that Republicans lose more often, win less often, is that going to make them just kind of slink away and go, well, fair and square, I guess we lost? I don't think so. I think it could radicalize them even further against the institutions of American democracy.
It's possible, but if you look at the Connerland victory in Western Pennsylvania,
yeah,
he ran as what used to be called a blue dog Democrat, more or less.
Yeah.
He ran as a moderate Democrat.
Sort of on cultural issues.
Yeah, I understand
yeah.
that. But it suggests to me that if you have a district that's more competitive, obviously 2 ways you can win. One is by just mobilizing your intense partisans, or you can win by broadening the base of your coalition.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, I think the good government hope is that by having districts that are more competitive, both sides are trying to, rather than just mobilize their partisans, they're trying to broaden their base. And that means neither the Democrat nor the Republican can be quite as extreme. Now,
All right, that's, to me, that's a slightly different issue than the gerrymandering issue. That's about what kind of Democrat should run, and should they woo Trump voters. That's more of that.
I know there's a debate within the Democratic Party about whether you win by broadening the base, you win by mobilization. I get that. But I guess my thought about geographically compact districts and so on, all the sort of anti-gerrymandering stuff, is that you're going to make the districts more competitive, and you don't win just by, you can't win necessarily just by speaking the echo chamber. And so, in some sense, I think one of the hopes of the people who are opposed to gerrymandering, or opposed to this political gerrymandering, is that it will pull both parties back to the center, because they can't win just by, you can't win just by ignoring the other side. You have.
No, that's a good point, and I certainly hope you're right. I do see the kind of structural logic to how that would work, but let me earn my Damon Downer nickname one last time by saying this, at the district level, I can see how that might work. One problem, though, is that we have one national election in this country, and it's for the president. And what you're describing is essentially, you need a Democratic Party where you have a Connor Lamb in Western Pennsylvania, but then, you have a different kind of Democrat in San Francisco or Provincetown or the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And yet a different one, in Brownsville, Texas, and, a different one in Provo, Utah, where they wouldn't win anyway. But you see my point. The problem is that for president, it's a national referendum where the party gets to decide who is the Democrat who will stand up and represent us against them. And that means that has huge impact. That's why Trump getting the nomination of the Republican Party was incredibly significant for the future direction of the party, whether or not he won, whether or not he was successful if he won, just because it was a statement that this is the guy who's going to stand up and beat the Republicans. Similarly, in 2020, the Democrats are going to have to decide, is it going to be a Connor Lamb, or is it going to be a Bernie Sanders, or a kind of intersectional candidate who kind of speaks a more kind of multicultural language and is very far on the left on economic issues. Depending on who wins the primary, you're going to get one or the other of those things, and then that becomes what the Democrats are in the eyes of a large part of the country. And the fact is that both parties are very, very divided, even against each other, against themselves right now. And so every time you get a candidate who makes part of the party happy and the other part furious, you sort of restart the whole polarization process.
We have time for one more question.
Hi.
I want to ask you a question about a kind of political institution that has historically served to expose people to folks from very different backgrounds, different sensibilities, political ideologies, particularly when involvement in it was required, which is the military, obviously. Now, is there any kind of required or at least highly incentivized national service that you think would be remotely politically possible, and that might serve the kind of function that required service in the military did for a number of generations and still does in a country like Israel, where people are thrown together with people very different from them, and at least develop some sort of fellow feeling with those who have very different ethnic backgrounds, political sensibilities?
Well, that's an interesting question. I wrote a column at some point in the past, let's say over the last year, I don't remember when, but I wrote a column actually in favor of bringing back the draft for that very reason. And I know that's not going to make me really unpopular in a room of young people.
Not necessarily politically possible.
But sort of for the sake of exactly this, that like we have no citizen-making institution anymore. I mean, our schools, public schools, don't really do that anymore. They have too many other things going on, and there are too many conflicts about which history do we teach, and so we sort of teach none of them. And it's true that for decades through the 20th century, there was an on-again, off-again draft that sort of turned people into Americans through forced service. Now, I know all the arguments on the other side. You got Milton Friedman saying this is like slavery to make people conscripts. You know, it's basically the state saying, here, go die, at least potentially, and that this is like tyrannical imposition of state power. And those are somewhat cogent arguments, and especially gain traction in our very libertarian age. But I think you're right. Now, is it possible? That's more complicated. I mean, I do think, short of the kind of existential military threat I talked about at the end, I doubt you could get support for it. Just because, you know, people don't want their own kids to have
What
to...
about national non-military service?
Maybe. I mean, we've tried that at various points. You know, the Clinton administration tried a kind of very wan, milquetoast version with AmeriCorps and ramping that up, spending more money on it. And I mean, I've known some students who went through that, and it was a positive experience for them. But it remained very, very much a volunteer thing. And as long as it's entirely volunteer, it's going to be peripheral. It'll be like the Peace Corps was in the 60s at best. You need to conscript people. Now, sure, maybe non-military conscription, so you're sent in to do what the New Deal did, Tennessee Valley Authority kind of thing, send people into rural communities, give them broadband internet, as if that's going to make things better. I don't think so. But you see what I mean. So I'm sympathetic to that suggestion, but the problem is, how do we get enough consensus to do anything big when we're already divided, even if that thing is something that would make us less divided? It's like a dog chasing its own tail. We need the cohesion first to develop the very program that might give us cohesion. And I don't really see a path there, but we'll see. John Bolton is our national security advisor now, which I think has greatly increased the risk of a major war. So for all we know, all our problems will be solved soon. Sorry.